The night air was thick, cold, and unsettling. Detective Eric Carter let out a long breath as he stepped out of his car, watching it turn to mist in the dim glow of the flickering streetlights. His body ached from a brutal 12-hour shift, 12 hours of chasing criminals, filling out endless reports, and dealing with the weight of a city that never truly rested. His mind buzzed with exhaustion, but something in his gut felt off. He pulled his black hoodie over his head, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you won't miss out on more thrilling stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and share this story with those who need to hear it. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. See you in the next exciting and meaningful story. The streets were unusually quiet, too quiet. A small corner store sat at the edge of the block, its neon sign blinking erratically, casting a dull, eerie glow on the sidewalk. Carter rubbed his hands together for warmth as he walked inside. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up, flipping through a worn-out newspaper. Carter grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of gum, his movements automatic, his mind still replaying the events of the day. He paid in cash, nodded to the clerk, and stepped back outside into the icy night. That's when he felt it. A presence. It wasn't just paranoia, something was watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of movement in the reflection of a parked car's window. A shadow, just out of reach, too fast, too deliberate to be a coincidence. Carter inhaled slowly, his instincts kicking in. He had spent years training for moments like this, but something about the air, about the silence, made this different. His pulse quickened as he started walking, his footsteps echoing against the pavement. He wasn't about to let fear dictate his movements, but every nerve in his body screamed that something was wrong. Then, the slow hum of an engine, a patrol car moving just a little too deliberately, trailing behind him. The headlights cast long, shifting shadows that danced along the cracked pavement. Carter kept walking, forcing himself to stay calm, his hand resting casually near his pocket. Then, "Stop right there, hands where I can see them." The voice was sharp, commanding, and filled with something Carter recognized all too well: suspicion. He turned, slow and measured, to face Officer Daniel Morris, who had stepped out of the patrol car, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. The officer's expression was unreadable, his eyes locked onto Carter like a predator sizing up its prey. Carter's stomach twisted. He had seen this look before. Too many times. "Is there a problem, officer?" Carter asked, keeping his voice steady. Morris's gaze never wavered. "You match the description of a robbery suspect. Black male, dark clothing." His voice was clipped, as if the accusation was already fact. Carter exhaled slowly, suppressing the frustration bubbling beneath his skin. "I'm Detective Carter. I just got off duty." He reached into his jacket, pulling out his badge. Morris didn't even glance at it. "Fake badges aren't hard to come by," Morris said, his grip on his weapon tightening. The street felt smaller now, the silence heavier. The feeling of being watched hadn't faded. In fact, it had grown worse. Something was waiting in the dark. And Carter had a sinking feeling that this night was far from over. The night felt colder now, sharper, as Detective Eric Carter stood beneath the flickering streetlights, his badge raised in his hand. But Officer Daniel Morris wasn't looking at the badge. He was looking at Carter, not as a fellow officer, not even as a man, but as a suspect. Carter could see it in his eyes, that thin, dangerous line between authority and paranoia. Morris's fingers flexed near his holstered weapon, his stance rigid with tension. The moment felt stretched, like a cord pulled too tight, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. "Put your hands where I can see them," Morris repeated, his voice laced with something just beneath the surface. Carter held back a sharp retort. He had been in too many situations like this to let his frustration win. Keeping his hands visible, he took a controlled breath. "Officer, I already told you. I'm Detective Carter, off duty, heading home." He lifted his badge slightly, making sure Morris could see it clearly. But Morris wasn't listening. His gaze flicked over Carter's hoodie, his dark clothing, his skin. He had already decided. He wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking for a reason. The night stretched, unnaturally quiet. A whisper of wind curled through the empty street, stirring the edges of Carter's hoodie. Somewhere in the distance, a street lamp buzzed before flickering out, leaving the alleyway to his right swallowed in darkness. Carter felt it again. That presence, that thing watching. His muscles tensed, but he kept his eyes locked on Morris, refusing to glance away. The last thing he needed was to give Morris an excuse. Behind him, the soft shuffle of footsteps. The crowd. He hadn't noticed them gathering. A few people stood at the edge of the street, phones raised, cameras rolling. The city had seen enough of these encounters to know how quickly they could spiral. A woman's voice cut through the air, her tone sharp with disbelief. "He just told you he's a detective." "Look at his badge." Another voice, angrier, called out. "What's wrong with you, man? You don't see what's happening?" Morris's jaw tightened. He took a step closer. "You're refusing to comply," he said, his voice like ice. Carter's patience thinned. "No, I'm refusing to be a victim of your bad instincts," he countered, his voice still calm, but with an edge now. "I've identified myself. The badge in my hand is real. If you still have doubts, call it in." Morris didn't move. For a moment, Carter wondered if he would even care what dispatch had to say. The tension boiled over. On the ground. Now. Morris drew his gun. The crowd gasped. The world seemed to hold its breath. The moment hung there, delicate, a heartbeat away from chaos. Carter's hand stayed raised, but his pulse pounded in his ears. His training told him to de-escalate, to keep his voice controlled. But how do you reason with a man who isn't listening? A deep, sinking feeling clawed its way up his spine. It wasn't just Morris anymore. Something else was here. The shadows in the alley seemed thicker, moving in ways they shouldn't. The streetlights flickered again, casting strange, jagged shapes across the pavement. Carter had faced criminals, killers, and even corrupt cops. But this felt different. The feeling of being watched had intensified. But it wasn't just from Morris or the crowd. Something else, something unseen, something just beyond the edge of light was waiting. The seconds stretched impossibly long. Morris's hands were steady, but his breath was uneven. The barrel of the gun pointed directly at Carter's chest. Then sirens. A flicker of blue and red down the street. Back up. Morris flinched. The moment cracked, like a spell breaking. Carter seized the opening, his voice cut through the electric air. "You better be damn sure about what you're doing, officer, because every single one of these people is filming you." Morris's grip on the gun didn't loosen. But his hesitation was there, flickering in his eyes. Doubt. And in the distance, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, something else flickered too. A shape, a shadow. Watching. The night wasn't done with them yet. The sharp wail of sirens sliced through the night, the flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the surrounding buildings like ominous beacons. Detective Eric Carter stood frozen in place, his hands still raised, his breath steady. But his mind was racing. The arrival of backup should have brought relief. It should have meant safety. But he wasn't sure if he believed in safety anymore. Officer Daniel Morris didn't lower his gun. His knuckles were white, his stance unwavering, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. He had been put on the spot. His authority challenged in front of a growing crowd, cameras rolling, a fellow officer refusing to bow to his demand. And men like Morris didn't like to lose control. The weight of the moment pressed against Carter's chest like a loaded gun. Then the squad cars screeched to a halt, doors swinging open with force. 3 officers emerged, their faces hard, assessing the scene in a matter of seconds. One of them, Sergeant Olivia Brooks, stepped forward, her eyes scanning the tension-laden street. She saw Morris first, his weapon still locked onto Carter. Then she saw Carter, his badge still clutched in his hand, his stance controlled but firm. And finally, she saw the crowd, their faces expectant, their phones raised like silent judges. "Morris, lower your weapon." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the thick tension like a blade, but Morris didn't move. His face twitched, his jaw clenched. His mind was still fighting against the reality of the situation. "He matches the description," Morris argued, his voice cracking just slightly at the edges. Brooks took another step forward, her hand hovering over her own holstered weapon. Not a threat, A warning. "Do you hear yourself right now?" she snapped. "That's Detective Carter from our own damn department, and you've got a loaded gun pointed at his chest." "Do you hear yourself right now?" she snapped. "That's Detective Carter from our own damn department, and you've got a loaded gun pointed at his chest." For the first time, real hesitation flickered across Morris's face. But before he could react, before he could make the right decision, something else shifted in the periphery. A flicker, a distortion. Carter saw it. A ripple in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. It moved like liquid darkness, something twisting unnaturally, as if it was barely holding its shape. It was the same presence that had been following him all night, and now it was closer, watching, waiting. A cold breath of wind slithered through the street, sending a chill up Carter's spine. Was he the only one who felt it? The crowd didn't seem to notice. Brooks didn't react. Morris was too blinded by his own anger. But Carter knew. Something else was here. His instincts screamed at him to move, to break away from the standoff before it was too late. But he couldn't. Not yet. Brooks exhaled sharply, her patience wearing thin. "Morris, stand, down, that's an order." The words seemed to finally reach him. Morris's grip on his gun faltered, his breathing ragged. He glanced at the crowd again, at the dozens of eyes locked onto him. Then at Carter. A storm of emotions flickered in his gaze. Anger, humiliation, resentment, fear. But more than anything, Carter saw something he hadn't expected. A flicker of something unnatural. Morris blinked, and for just a second Carter swore his pupils were wrong. Stretched, distorted, inhuman. Then the moment was gone. Morris let out a sharp breath, stepping back, finally holstering his gun. The crowd erupted, some in relief, others in outrage. Voices overlapped, accusations flew, the street erupting into a cacophony of noise and chaos. Carter barely heard any of it. His heartbeat was in his ears, drowning out the sounds of the city. His gaze flickered to the alleyway again, but the shadow was gone. Had it ever been there? Or had he just seen something he wasn't meant to see? Brooks turned to Carter, her voice still tense but measured. "You all right?" Carter hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer that. Because the truth was, something about tonight had changed. And whatever it was, he wasn't sure if it was over yet. The chaos didn't end when Officer Daniel Morris finally holstered his weapon. If anything, it only ignited something bigger. The crowd surged forward, voices rising in a mix of relief and outrage. Some cheered that Carter had made it through the encounter alive, because in this city, that wasn't always guaranteed. Others shouted at Morris, hurling accusations at him, demanding answers. Phones were still raised, capturing every detail. Sergeant Olivia Brooks stood between them, raising a firm hand. "Back up. Now." Her voice carried authority, but there was an edge of exhaustion behind it. Carter lowered his arms, his muscles still tight with lingering tension. He could feel the adrenaline still thrumming through his veins, making his hands unsteady. He wasn't shaken easily, but this had been different. Brooks turned to him. "I need you to come down to the station and give a full statement." He nodded but didn't speak. He was still processing. Not just what had happened, but what he had seen. He glanced back toward the alley where the shadows had twisted, where something had been watching. But now there was nothing. Just empty darkness. Had it really been there? Or had his mind been playing tricks on him? Morris was stiff, his face tight with frustration as another officer escorted him away. His jaw clenched, his eyes still burning with something Carter couldn't quite place. Humiliation, anger, or something else entirely. Carter didn't trust it. The city watches. By the time Carter arrived at the precinct, the video of the incident was already everywhere. The footage spread like wildfire across social media. The moment Morris pulled his gun, the tension in Carter's stance, the cries from the crowd. The comments came just as fast. Another black man nearly gunned down. What if he didn't have a badge? How many times has this happened when no one was watching? And then there were the stranger ones, posts with blurry screenshots. Images where the shadows behind Carter looked off. People circled parts of the video, pointing out something in the background. A shape, a distortion, something lurking just beyond the streetlights. Carter stared at his phone, scrolling through the comments. He felt that same chill from earlier creep up his spine. Was it just a trick of the light, or had someone else seen what he had? A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Brooks stepped inside, arms crossed. Chief wants a full debrief in the morning. Morris is suspended until further notice. Carter let out a slow breath. That's it? For now, she admitted, internal affairs is involved, but you know how this goes. Yeah. He did. Cops like Morris didn't always face real consequences. Brooks hesitated, then leaned in slightly. What happened out there, Carter? And don't just give me the official version. He looked up at her, debating how much to say. He knew how it sounded. I saw something, he finally admitted. Brooks frowned. Something like what? He shook his head. I don't know, but it wasn't just Morris that was wrong out there tonight. Her gaze was sharp, studying him. You need sleep, she said finally. Get some rest. This isn't over. Carter wasn't sure if she meant the case or whatever had been in the dark. Either way, she was right. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days that followed were a blur of headlines, meetings, and scrutiny. The footage of the confrontation had spread beyond just social media. It was on the news, in heated debates on talk shows, and blasted across every major network. The narrative was already being shaped. Some called Carter a hero, a man who had survived what could have been another tragic case of mistaken identity. Others, mostly those who refused to acknowledge the deeper problem, insisted that Morris had just been doing his job, and that Carter had overreacted. But beneath all of it, Carter knew something else had happened that night, something no one was talking about. He sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, reading the comments under the viral videos. Among the expected outrage and debates, there was a pattern emerging. A few users had started sharing edited frames of the footage, pointing out distortions, blurry shapes, something in the shadows that didn't look quite right. Some claimed it was just video compression, a trick of the light. But others. Did anyone else see it? The thing behind him. Look at the alleyway in frame 048. What is that? Carter wasn't just being watched by the cop. Something else was watching him too. Carter zoomed in on one of the images. His blood ran cold. In the darkness of the alley, just beyond where he had stood, there was something there. It wasn't fully formed, just a jagged, twisting shape, a figure that seemed half real, as if the camera itself had struggled to capture it. He hadn't imagined it. His breath hitched. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, trying to suppress the creeping sense of dread curling in his gut. A notification popped up on his phone. A direct message from an anonymous account. You saw it, didn't you? Carter's pulse quickened. His fingers hovered over the screen. He hesitated, then typed back. Who are you? The reply came almost instantly. Someone who's seen it before. His grip on the phone tightened. He was about to respond when knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through his apartment, sudden and sharp. His stomach twisted. It was late, too late for visitors. Slowly, Carter stood, his instincts kicking in. He moved cautiously toward the door, his hand instinctively brushing against the holster at his waist, even though he knew he was off duty. He checked the peephole. No one was there. The hallway was empty, but the uneasy feeling hadn't left. It clung to him like static electricity crawling beneath his skin. He stepped back, his pulse still hammering, when his phone buzzed again. A new message. Don't open the door. Carter's breath caught in his throat. He turned back to the peephole, heart pounding. And for just a split second, he saw something move. A shadow. A flicker of something standing just outside his door, then gone. His skin prickled. Every instinct in his body screamed at him that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Detective Eric Carter stood frozen in his apartment, his breath shallow, his heartbeat thudding like distant war drums in his chest. His phone was still in his hand, the words glowing on the screen like an omen. Don't open the door. The warning had come too late. Something had already been there, watching, waiting. Slowly, Carter stepped away from the door, every nerve in his body on high alert. He could still feel it. That presence. That thing that had been trailing him since that night. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It wasn't just exhaustion. Something was following him. His mind raced through possibilities, a prank, a hoax, or something much worse. Carter tightened his grip on his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He needed answers. "Who are you?" he typed, sending the message back to the anonymous sender. The reply came instantly, almost as if whoever or whatever was on the other end had been waiting. "You're not supposed to see it." A chill crawled down Carter's spine. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. "Think, damn it. Stay rational." He typed again. "See what?" For a moment, nothing. The screen remained blank. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then 3 dots appeared. Typing. Then, "It's attached to you now." Carter's stomach twisted. His fingers felt stiff, his skin clammy despite the chill in the air. Attached. What the hell did that mean? He turned sharply, scanning the dimly lit apartment. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. Every dark corner suddenly felt occupied. His pulse pounded against his ribs. He had been a cop for years, faced killers, gangsters, and criminals of every kind. But this was different. This wasn't something he could put in handcuffs. The screen flashed again. "It follows those who notice it." Carter clenched his jaw, fighting back the growing unease, gnawing at the edges of his mind. His instincts screamed for him to leave, but leave and go where? This wasn't something he could outrun. He forced himself to type one last question. "How do I stop it?" This time, the reply took longer, as if the sender didn't want to answer. Or maybe there wasn't an answer. Finally, the words appeared. "You don't?" Carter's breath caught. He stared at the screen, pulse hammering. Then, knock, knock, knock. His body went rigid. This time, it wasn't just a sound. It wasn't just the echo of paranoia creeping into his thoughts. The knock came from inside the apartment. Behind him, Carter's breath hitched. His entire body went ice cold. Slowly, painfully slowly, he turned his head, his every muscle tense, his heart slamming against his ribs. There was nothing there, just his apartment. Just the dim glow of the kitchen light, just a shadow. Not his. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the light, its shape shifting, twisting. Wrong. Its presence thickened the air, an invisible weight pressing down on Carter's chest. It didn't move, but Carter knew somehow it was smiling. His phone buzzed again, still clutched in his trembling fingers. One last message. "It's too late." And then the lights went out.